Good evening. While the world has been fixated on frontline battles and missile exchanges, something far more consequential happened in the shadows 3 days ago. No press conferences, no dramatic announcements, no carefully staged briefings for international media. Just a single operation that has fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of this conflict in ways that most people have not yet grasped. What I'm about to tell you tonight comes from intelligence reporting that surfaced not because anyone wanted it public, but because the aftershocks were impossible to contain. You will not find this story summarized accurately in breaking news alerts. You will not see it explained clearly on social media timelines. And you will almost certainly hear official denials or carefully worded non-responses in the coming hours. But none of that changes what has already occurred. Ukraine executed a covert strike deep inside Russian territory. Not a drone attack on border infrastructure. Not a cross-border raid by special forces. Something entirely different. Something that has left Moscow scrambling to understand how their most protected assets became vulnerable to an enemy they believed they had contained. This operation represents a fundamental shift in Ukraine's capabilities. For more than 2 years, Ukraine has been fighting a defensive war shaped by geography, resources, and the constant pressure of Russian escalation. Every major decision carried the weight of survival. Every strategic choice was filtered through the reality of limited options and overwhelming odds. That framework just changed. According to multiple sources with direct access to operational intelligence, Ukraine successfully penetrated Russian strategic infrastructure using methods that were not supposed to exist in their arsenal. This was not about destroying a single target or achieving a tactical advantage. This was about demonstrating reach, precision, and operational sophistication that forces Moscow to recalculate everything they thought they knew about Ukrainian capabilities. The target itself tells you everything you need to understand about the significance of this moment. Russia has spent enormous resources protecting critical infrastructure deep inside their territory. Layer upon layer of air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and physical security measures designed to create sanctuary zones where strategic assets could operate without threat. Those sanctuary zones no longer exist. What makes this operation remarkable is not just its success, but its invisibility. For 72 hours, Russian officials appeared unaware that anything had occurred. Communications continued normally. Operations proceeded as scheduled. Security protocols remained unchanged. It was only when secondary effects began manifesting that Moscow realized they had been compromised. Those secondary effects are what make this story impossible to suppress. When strategic infrastructure fails, the consequences ripple through interconnected systems in ways that cannot be hidden. Power grids register anomalies. Transportation networks experience disruptions. Communication channels show gaps that require explanation. Moscow found itself managing cascading problems without initially understanding their source. The moment of recognition came through intercepted communications that have since been shared quietly among Allied intelligence services. A Russian official, speaking to what he believed was a secure channel, asked a question that revealed the depth of their confusion. The question was simple and devastating. How did they reach assets we classified as untouchable? That question encapsulates the strategic earthquake Ukraine has triggered. For 2 years, Russia operated under the assumption that certain capabilities were beyond Ukrainian reach. That assumption shaped military planning, resource allocation, and risk assessment. It informed decisions about where to position valuable assets and how to protect them. That assumption is now obsolete. Russian military doctrine has always emphasized strategic depth as a core defensive principle. The idea that vast distances and layered defenses create zones of absolute security where critical operations can proceed without external threat. This doctrine shaped Soviet military thinking for decades and remains central to Russian strategic planning today. Ukraine just proved that doctrine is no longer viable in modern warfare. The implications extend far beyond military planning. When an adversary demonstrates capabilities you did not know they possessed, every previous calculation becomes suspect. What other surprises are waiting? What other assumptions need revision? How many other supposedly secure assets are actually vulnerable? These questions create paralysis in strategic thinking because they force planners to operate without confidence in their foundational beliefs. Inside the Kremlin, this operation has triggered what sources describe as an urgent reassessment of defensive priorities. Meetings that were scheduled weeks in advance have been cancelled. Personnel who were considered indispensable to current operations have been reassigned to emergency reviews. Resources that were committed to offensive campaigns are being redirected toward protecting assets that were previously considered secure. This reallocation of effort represents exactly the kind of strategic disruption that Ukraine has been seeking since the beginning of this conflict. Russia's greatest advantage has always been its ability to maintain offensive pressure while keeping its strategic depth protected. When that depth becomes questionable, offensive operations become more costly and less sustainable. The technical aspects of how Ukraine achieved this breakthrough remain classified, but the operational signature suggests capabilities that did not exist 6 months ago. Either Ukraine developed new methods independently, or they received assistance that has not been publicly acknowledged. Both possibilities create problems for Russian planners who must now defend against threats they cannot fully understand. What we do know is that this operation required extensive preparation, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and precise execution under conditions of extreme risk. The fact that it succeeded suggests organizational capabilities within Ukrainian special operations that have matured far beyond what most observers believed possible. For Ukraine, this moment represents more than tactical success. It demonstrates that defensive wars need not remain purely defensive, that geographical disadvantages can be overcome through innovation and operational excellence, that asymmetric capabilities can create strategic effects disproportionate to their size. These lessons will shape Ukrainian planning for months to come. The psychological impact on Russian leadership cannot be understated. For 2 years, Moscow has operated with confidence that their strategic assets remain beyond Ukrainian reach. This confidence informed risk-taking, resource allocation, and long-term planning. When that confidence disappears, decision-making becomes more cautious, more defensive, and less efficient. Russian state media has remained conspicuously silent about this operation. No dramatic denials, no angry responses, no threats of retaliation. This silence is more revealing than any official statement because it suggests uncertainty about how to respond to a capability they did not anticipate. When adversaries surprise you completely, the first instinct is often to avoid revealing the extent of your confusion. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials have made no public claims about this operation. No victory announcements, no dramatic revelations, no attempts to capitalize on success for propaganda purposes. This restraint suggests strategic thinking that prioritizes operational security over immediate political gains. The message is being sent through actions, not words. The broader implications for this conflict are only beginning to emerge. When one side demonstrates previously unknown capabilities, the other side must adapt their entire approach to account for new realities. This adaptation takes time, resources, and strategic focus that might otherwise be directed toward offensive operations. What happens next will likely unfold without fanfare. There may be no dramatic escalation, no immediate retaliation, no public acknowledgement that anything significant has occurred. Strategic shifts often happen quietly, through adjustments in planning, changes in resource allocation, and modifications to operational procedures that are invisible to outside observers. But beneath this surface calm, both sides are recalculating. Ukraine is assessing how to build on this success without triggering responses that could compromise future operations. Russia is struggling to understand how their strategic assumptions were so thoroughly wrong and what other surprises might be waiting. The war in Ukraine has just entered a new phase. not because of dramatic battlefield changes or political developments, but because the rules of engagement have shifted in ways that force both sides to operate differently. Ukraine has demonstrated reach that Moscow believed impossible. Moscow must now defend assets they thought were secure. This recalibration will take time to fully manifest, but its effects are already beginning to reshape the conflict in subtle but significant ways. For Russia, the most disturbing aspect of this operation is not what Ukraine accomplished, but how they accomplished it. Intelligence assessments now circulating among Moscow's security apparatus suggest that Ukraine's penetration of Russian strategic infrastructure relied on methodologies that bypass traditional defensive frameworks entirely. This represents a fundamental evolution in asymmetric warfare capabilities that Russian planners are struggling to comprehend. The technical sophistication required for this operation indicates access to intelligence, technology, and operational expertise that Ukraine was not supposed to possess. Either Ukrainian capabilities have advanced far more rapidly than anyone anticipated, or support networks exist that have remained successfully hidden from Russian surveillance. Both possibilities create profound challenges for Moscow's strategic planning apparatus. What makes this development particularly destabilizing is the precision with which it was executed. This was not a brute force attack relying on overwhelming numbers or firepower. This was surgical, targeted, and designed to achieve maximum strategic impact with minimal visible footprint. The operation succeeded not because Ukraine overpowered Russian defenses, but because they circumvented those defenses entirely. Russian military analysts are now faced with the uncomfortable reality that their defensive assumptions were built on incomplete understanding of modern warfare dynamics. The layered security systems that were supposed to protect critical infrastructure proved inadequate against methods that Russian planners had not fully considered. This gap in strategic thinking has created vulnerabilities that extend far beyond the immediate target. The operational aftermath has forced Moscow into a defensive posture that contradicts their preferred strategic approach. Resources that were dedicated to maintaining offensive pressure against Ukrainian positions are now being redirected toward protecting assets that were previously considered secure. This reallocation represents exactly the kind of strategic disruption that Ukraine has been seeking since the conflict began. Inside Russian command structures, this operation has triggered urgent reviews of security protocols across all critical infrastructure sites. Personnel who were focused on offensive planning are now assigned to vulnerability assessments. Equipment that was positioned for forward operations is being repositioned for defensive purposes. These shifts create gaps in Russian offensive capabilities that Ukraine can exploit. The timing of this operation was carefully calculated to maximize strategic confusion. By demonstrating these capabilities during a period when Russian leadership believed their strategic depth remained secure, Ukraine has forced Moscow to question fundamental assumptions about the conflict's trajectory. This uncertainty creates decision-making paralysis that benefits Ukrainian strategic objectives. For Ukrainian leadership, this success validates a strategic approach that prioritizes asymmetric capabilities over conventional force multiplication. Rather than attempting to match Russian military capacity directly, Ukraine has focused on developing operational methods that exploit specific vulnerabilities in Russian strategic thinking. This approach allows smaller forces to achieve disproportionate strategic effects. The international implications of this operation extend beyond the immediate conflict zone. Allied intelligence services are studying Ukrainian methods to understand how similar capabilities might be developed or countered in other theaters. The operational principles demonstrated here have applications that reach far beyond the current conflict in Ukraine. Moscow's response to this operation will likely focus on damage control rather than retaliation. The primary concern for Russian leadership is preventing additional surprises of similar magnitude. This defensive focus requires significant resource allocation and strategic attention that reduces Moscow's capacity for offensive operations elsewhere. The psychological impact on Russian military personnel cannot be overlooked. For months, troops and commanders operated under the assumption that certain areas remained safe from Ukrainian action. That assumption provided psychological security that influenced everything from deployment decisions to morale maintenance. When that security disappears, operational effectiveness suffers across multiple domains. Ukrainian special operations capabilities have clearly evolved beyond what most external observers recognized. This operation required coordination, intelligence gathering, and execution standards that suggest organizational maturity within Ukrainian military structures. These capabilities will likely be applied to additional targets as Ukrainian leadership identifies opportunities for strategic disruption. The silence from both governments regarding this operation reflects the sensitive nature of its strategic implications. Public acknowledgement would force responses that neither side currently wants to manage. Ukraine prefers to maintain operational security for future activities. Russia prefers to avoid highlighting defensive failures that could encourage additional attacks. What emerges from this development is a new phase of the conflict characterized by uncertainty about defensive adequacy and offensive reach. Russian planners must now operate under the assumption that no asset is completely secure. Ukrainian planners can now consider targets that were previously beyond their operational scope. These shifts fundamentally alter the strategic calculus for both sides. The cascading effects of this operation will continue to manifest in ways that may not be immediately visible. Strategic planning cycles, resource allocation decisions, and operational priorities are all being adjusted to account for new realities. These adjustments take time to implement, but create lasting changes in how both sides approach the conflict. As this new phase unfolds, the conflict's trajectory becomes less predictable. When established assumptions about capability and vulnerability prove incorrect, both sides must operate with greater caution and reduced confidence in their strategic frameworks. This uncertainty creates opportunities for additional surprises that could further reshape the conflict's dynamics. The operation Ukraine executed 3 days ago was not just a tactical success. It was a strategic statement that the rules of this conflict have fundamentally changed. Moscow is still calculating what that change means for their planning and positioning. Ukraine is preparing to build on the advantages this new capability provides. 3 days ago, Ukraine demonstrated that the impossible had become inevitable. A single covert operation shattered Russian strategic assumptions and forced Moscow to confront a reality they were unprepared to face. Their most protected assets were no longer untouchable. Their defensive doctrine was no longer adequate. Their confidence in strategic depth was no longer justified. This was not about one successful mission. This was about proving that the framework of this entire conflict had shifted in ways that most people have not yet recognized. Ukraine moved from reactive defense to strategic offense without announcing the transition. Moscow discovered their vulnerabilities through consequences rather than intelligence. The world witnessed a demonstration of capabilities that existed in shadows until the moment they mattered most. What makes this moment historically significant is not the immediate tactical result, but the strategic precedent it establishes. When one side proves that sanctuary zones do not exist, both sides must operate differently. When assumptions about reach and vulnerability collapse, new calculations become necessary. When silence speaks louder than announcements, the message reaches those who need to understand it most clearly. The war in Ukraine entered a new phase 3 days ago, not through dramatic declarations or public ceremonies, but through precision, planning, and operational excellence that changed everything while appearing to change nothing at all. Moscow is still processing what happened. Ukraine is already planning what comes next. And the world is beginning to understand that some victories are measured not in territory gained, but in assumptions destroyed.